Welcome to the second of the research concert series hosted by the Department of Music at NTNU. My name is Michael Duch and I'm the Deputy Head of Research at the department, and I'm really happy that we've got some guests today. I was planning to say something and introduce the project, but in a way I think it makes more sense that you do that yourself. So Josh, Christopher, I don't know who of you would like to start and tell us what this project is all about.
What's it all about? Yes, I'm Christopher, this is Josh. I'm a musician, artistic researcher based at the University of Music and Performing Arts Graz. And I'm one of 3 people involved in this project, which is called Musical, in brackets, Improvisation and Ethics. I work with Josh Bergamin, a philosopher, and the anthropologist Caroline Gatt at the University of Graz, who's not here for this lab. And it's a 4-year project, interdisciplinary, as you see, philosophy, anthropology, and artistic research. And we're looking at the improvisational aspects of ethics in general, not just in music, but particularly through musical case studies, so through the lens of musical practice. That's might be a slightly obscure connection for you, might open up some big questions, and so we'll talk about that over the course of this chat. Important to know is that the musical case studies are these labs that we're doing. There's 7 of them over the course of the project where we work as a team with largish improvising ensembles, first alone and then in combination. And these are, let's say, week-long or 10-day packages where we play with the musicians and propose ideas to work on that bring out ethical phenomena that are already embedded in their ways of playing, so that we can talk about it and make music around that. And then we have these public events. And this is the 4th of 7 today. And I'll talk a little bit more about my own interest in the project. Maybe Josh can first tell you a bit about the ethics angle that we're looking at and what we mean by that.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Josh Bergamin. I'm at the University of Vienna and I work as a philosopher. So improvisation has become a much more live topic in philosophy as well as many other disciplines now. So it's a really exciting time to, I think, be here. And particularly in the context of ethics, I guess there's a lot of, when we think about ethics, we tend to think about normative frameworks. So things like why things are good, why things are bad, how we should act, how we should not. And central to this is the idea of freedom and decision, which is something I think which resonates with musicians, particularly in the jazz world. In a sense, something can't be ethical if you don't have a choice. So, and you see that we don't blame people when a tree falls onto their house, or we don't blame the tree. But we do blame someone who drives a car into a house when they're drunk, because there is an element of choice there, and the degrees of culpability that we have, the degrees that something can be judged as moral or not, depends on that element of that freedom to make a choice. The same reason that we hold humans to be ethical, responsible beings, whereas we might not blame a dog for being cruel in the same way as a people. So this question of freedom is really alive here. I think it's one of the things which connects us to jazz. So the thing I'm really interested in here is what shapes our freedom and how much that freedom is actually internal to us. And I've been thinking a lot about the sort of roots of improvisation. So I'm sure a lot of you know improvisation comes from the Latin. It means not foreseen. So the elements in music or practice which aren't sort of out there in front. And a friend of mine asked me, well, okay, that's improvisation, but what about the provisos? What about the foreseen? I think proviso in Norwegian is like forbehold. So it's the things which are there already. And it's interesting, I normally think about these in terms of, say, less free forms of jazz. And you can think of things like the key, you can think about rhythms, you can think about time signatures, all of these things which are given. And so these things are, in a sense, they're chosen, but if you're in a band and they're saying, play a solo in A minor, then the notes that you can choose from are really restricted. You have that palette of notes, and you often don't freely need to choose them. Those things are already habituated in your body. And you can think about that with other elements of the music too, about playing in time, and these kind of invisible structures are things which connect you to your audiences as well. So they'll know when you're out of time or not. And so two things I'll say, so we can have more time for discussion, but the first is that in this free music, a lot of these very explicit provisos are not there. So the kind of music we've been working on, mostly with the groups we've been working with, they won't set a key at the front start, they won't set a time signature, it's very, very open. But at the same time, we talk about things like a band sound, we talk about things that they like to hear in the music, and these kind of things emerge, these kind of provisos, these structures come from somewhere and they guide us. I'm very curious where these things are. And the second thing I'm interested about is where these things might apply to things in the world as well around us. So when we think of ourselves as free beings who are making choices going around the world, but actually so much of our life is structured by invisible things like laws, things like norms of politeness, material things like streets and buses and whatnot. And so thinking in terms of how we improvise and navigate through these structures, I think is really fascinating way to combine what happens in music with actually how we live life in a broader sense. So this is kind of one of the core things where we're coming from in this project.
So I have this funny dual role in the project. I'm both a researcher and a musician. And I guess those two roles are united in the task I've given myself to work with the musicians in a way that brings the ethical phenomena that's already present in their practice to the surface. So the provisos that Josh is talking about that might not be explicitly agreed upon or might not be verbalized, but norms that are present in certain ensembles but aren't spoken, or certain kinds of structures that often show up in larger improvising ensembles that are rooted in particular constellations of people that go beyond individuals, stuff like that. So these are provisos that are there and have some kind of ethical impact on what's going on among the people and on the musical result. And what I'm interested in is making this stuff visible and audible for two different reasons. One is so we can make music with it more consciously and more actively. So it's not just about bringing it to surface for purposes of verbal reflection, but it's also working through things that might give us more musical possibilities if we're more aware of them. For example, these norms we talk about might differ a lot between different musicians in a band. They might have different kinds of sounds in their toolbox. They might have different priorities when they're interacting with other people, or they might be paying attention to different kinds of stuff in the space. And what happens when that stuff comes into conflict? How do people work with that? So I try to put a spotlight on that so we can make music with that. We can use it to push the process forward. And the other thing is trying to make this stuff visible for people beyond the immediate practice. So that involves both my colleagues who are interested in the theoretical aspects of ethics, who have a sense of how this stuff works through the music already, but might need a push in order to see these things crystallize in a more detailed way. So I'm kind of serving both sides of the story, both the musical side and the theoretical side. And the way, there's lots of different ways to do this, but one of the ways that I'm doing is through what I call interventions, which is kind of an umbrella term for exercises and concepts and simple scores that frame some ethical aspect of the musical practice, and allow everyone to be working with it on some level at the same time. And the first musical interlude of today will include one of those. I don't want to spoil the surprise, but you might want to be looking for the proviso or the intervention that I've offered.
Yeah, so I guess but what are you kind of looking for? Why do you want to do these interventions? I mean, you've already spoken a bit about this, but because what I find is really interesting is that, you know, we talk about free improvisation, we talk about experimental music, and we always end up talking about how free is the free improvised music and how experimental is the experimental music. I think I asked George Lewis that question once. We were talking in the situation, and then he replied, "Well, how Scottish is Scottish," for instance. And then saying that, you know, in a way, for him it wasn't that important. But then again, others, I suppose, like Eddie Prevost, talk about, you know, self-invention and stuff like that. So what's the goal with these practical interventions?
Well, I generally don't use the word free improvisation.
Mm.
I prefer the term experimental improvisation because it's more inclusive. And I think that as a matter of historical fact, you know, a lot of people doing this sort of thing that we're doing use all kinds of different resources in order to structure what they're doing, whether that's scores or verbal agreements or just developing a band sound over a number of years or decades together. So I don't mind if people use the word free, but for me it's not really a hot topic. It's, you know, some way that some people see it, and that's cool. But the interventions are there, again, to put a spotlight on certain stuff that might already be in the mix, but to really bring it out and see what happens on a musical level, not only on an intellectual level, but like at the level of feeling and affect and form when we think about that or we look for that in the musical process.
Because I think a lot of people they talk about improvisation as a way of breaking your own habits, but I suppose a lot of people who are involved in improvisation end up in some kind of habits anyway, and I suppose maybe that's what you're trying to address here in a way.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's this interesting kind of, it's not quite a paradox, but it's something like that, where in order to improvise really well, to be very open, you need to practice a lot. You need to habituate yourself to doing things which are unforeseen in the most open sense of improvisation. And I think those kind of skills, I mean, these are as well ethical practices. They're sort of not responding to key things like in a fixed score, but you're responding to certain things. They need to make sense. The question I often ask of musicians is, you know, how do you know when things are working? Or how do you know things are not working? Especially in things when there aren't these kind of explicit rules. And there, I think it becomes a lot more about these. I mean, the first answer is usually, well, you know, you just know, or it sounds good, it feels right. But these things feel right because we're habituated to that, because we even if we can't explicitly say them, these norms are there in the music, and we can connect to that. We can understand why that made sense in that moment. And that's very much a social process. People don't always agree that the music is working, as you know, but there are those moments when it does work for everybody too, and that's quite fascinating. I think these are the things which help drive cultures forward, which again is interesting to think of beyond music. You know, how do these practices develop and evolve in ways that people make sense together of the kind of things they're doing.
Yeah, I think it's that the Lee Konitz quote, which is, that's my way of preparation, not to be prepared, and that takes a lot of preparation.
That's beautiful.
So I guess there's time for some music now.
I would hope so.
Yeah. What are we about to hear?
I won't spoil
Okay.
the punchline.
Okay.
Please welcome the band.
was just a little taste of what you'll be hearing here tomorrow. So now we'll continue our talk, and in addition to myself, Christopher and Josh, we've got some other people here in the panel, and they can introduce themselves.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this experiment. I'm Sofia, Efstathiou. I'm a philosopher, and I'm based here at NTNU in the program for applied ethics. And should I say something about my work or just my name at this point? Well, we can come back to that.
Hi, I'm Eira Bjørnstad Foss. I'm a part of this project as a violinist. I can just say that I'm the only one in this setting now that has the classical background, which we can, I guess, talk about a bit, because that has been a bit, it's made some choices between us in the band for what we do or not do, maybe. And I'm also doing a PhD in artistic research at NTNU right now. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Kyrre Laastad. I am also in this project as a drummer. I work with music in various ways. I play, and I also work a lot as a recording engineer. So my background is from, I guess, jazz, but I feel like a potato which can fit into many stews.
Right, so should we go into what we just heard? Or should, what was that all about?
Well, I can't tell you much because I wasn't up there. But you might have noticed there were these beer mats being passed around a couple of times. And the beer mat says,
Give this beer mat to somebody else during the performance.
and on the back it says,
How? When? Does it matter?
yeah. Maybe that's a good way to start the talking round. How, when does it matter about these beer mats? And what was the relationship to the music?
For me, I would like to hear from the musicians that were on stage a little bit, and also from people who, got a beer mat or were given a beer mat to see what that added to their experience of the improvisation. But I guess for just going back to the previous conversation, that was a constraint or a structure that was introduced in this experiment, Christopher and Josh?
Yeah, I guess these guys weren't playing, but just to put it in the context of the lab, so one of the things I think Christopher talked about when he introduced interventions in the first iteration of labs was this idea of involving a bit of friction. And one thing that came up a lot during the week of workshops was that this doesn't really feel entirely natural. It kind of increases a bit of like the mental load, even though there are naturally constraints and there are relationships. You might be listening to one particular person or maybe wondering what someone else is thinking about what you're playing or where you're going to fit in. That might be sort of more in a cloud, sort of, informing how you play, but maybe not the central thing. And something like this perhaps might bring up those questions more explicitly. So maybe a question for Kyrre and Eira would be like, did you have this experience during the labs that when the interventions were difficult, that you kind of had to think about things which didn't feel natural? And what is that about feeling natural when you play? What's the difference between playing with a explicit rule and just freely playing?
Good question, Josh. To me, with this particular Bergamin thing, I was like, kind of hard to relate that to how I like to play music, so I kind of ended up ignoring it. There's also, you're sitting behind a drum kit, there's drumsticks everywhere and cymbals, and just drawing a breath makes a sound, and if you're gonna get up and move, it's gonna be like things are gonna top over, it's gonna become a whole scene. And so the alternative then is to like throw the bear mat, which also seems like a big gesture for me. So I ended up having it in my breast pocket, and I watched the other people do it. Which also changed the music, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think you can choose not to want to use these bear mats, but the fact that they are there, of course, affects you in one way, because then you have to spend some energy and thinking about it, although you don't want to, maybe. So I was also having this beer mat in the first, in the start of one of the rehearsal days, and it was something about what is too much, what is too little. Do you remember what the text on that beer mat?
Yeah, there was a beer mat that on the front side said once, twice, again, and on the back side it said how much is too much, how much is not enough. That was Josh's idea, actually.
Yeah, so that made me, when I played, I just felt that it was too much all the time. Yeah, but the question from Josh was, what was your question?
So even beyond the beer mat, but to other interventions, several people commented during the lab that just having that sort of extra things to think about changed the way that they would play. It didn't feel natural. But that's also quite curious. And what does feeling natural feel like? Why is it important to feel natural? And how does that affect the music?
Yeah, because it takes the attention away from, for me it takes attention away from just listening. So I felt a bit that I had to concentrate about this thing that made me less concentrated about the others.
Can I kind of invite everyone to a little game performance to think about the concept of structure? Yes? Why not? So if you want to participate, then we all stand up, and I invite you to walk around the room any way you like, okay? It will only take a little bit, so just walk around the room any way you like. It can be any pace, can be any direction. And now find a person, pick a person in the room, and keep walking, just making sure this person you have picked is always on your left. So keep walking with this person always on your left. Keep walking with this person on your left. And now quit and walk as you like again. Maybe you still want to walk with this person on your left, but maybe not. Great, keep walking. And now find a person, maybe the same, maybe another one, and keep walking with the person on your right. Walk with this person always on your right. Wonderful. And quit that too. Walk as you like, as a solo being, maybe. And are you ready for the last step? Now pick 2 people and keep walking with one of them on your left and the other one on your right. And keep walking. Or not. Okay, wonderful. Give yourselves a hand. And let's all reflect a little bit. I thought it might be nice to do something, like with everyone. I've developed this game format, I call it the responsible walk, response/able walk. And for me, it's a way to think about the idea of responsibility, which is an ethical concept on some level. So it's like responding to the other as a significant other. But kind of at the same time, looking at, like these kind of choices that we make. For example, I don't know, it's just pick up, but sometimes you pick the more convenient person somehow to respond to. And I thought it could be a nice exercise to do with you here because of the idea of the structures that you mentioned. And what's sort of, for me, it was interesting to do this in a room full of stuff that, on some level, there were the rules that I was kind of offering for you to follow or not. But then there was also the stuff in the room that was kind of the structure that was constraining our ability to respond to each other in that sense. So I just thought I might put one more thing on the table here for all of us.
Thanks for that. That was really fun. And it's actually, so we were talking in the last weeks about the kind of interventions we might do in this lab. There's a game that I play which is very, very similar to that.
Awesome.
It's got a different name, but it's the same principle. You pick 2 different people and it guides how you walk and you do 2 at once. But what I find really interesting about that is with these very simple rules, quite elaborate patterns start to form. And I really like thinking a lot about the sense of agency, and particularly in a group. And this comes back to that question of freedom and control, is that with some very simple sort of structures, all of a sudden the individual becomes subsumed into the group, and the group kind of gains its own agency. And I think
it's very interesting. Like, for example, I don't know if you noticed, but in some places we created these little clusters of people because each of us had like 2 rules that we were following, one person on the left, but then something else emerged from all of us doing that, which was a cluster. And I think this phenomenon of like social emergence, it's like in that situation, are we responsible for making this cluster? None of us really wanted to make a cluster. We just want to have these 2 people next to us. But what emerges is a social structure. You can think of segregation, you can think of all these other things, that might, evoke like a social issue, like a big issue. But I think this is very, like exactly that, what you're saying, Josh, like who is responsible,
And then when you want to change that, how do you change that? If you just start doing something different, would you have to abandon all the rules altogether, or?
Well, there's a flip side to this as well, which is not everyone is participating. That there are rules in one sense, but there are also, the game is optional, so to speak, or the degree of investment that each of us has in the offering changes a lot from person to person. We were lucky in this case because most of the people just jumped in, but like the guys doing sound back there weren't really able to do that. And they're in the same room and the rules were there, but there's different capabilities and there's different degrees of attachment to what's happening here in the middle of the room. And that's another important part of these interventions as well. It's not just about everybody doing what's offered and seeing what comes out of that, but seeing what people find or don't find is useful to them in the offering itself. And the beer mat is a good case of that. Like, some people just aren't interested. It's a distraction for them, and that's okay. It's not necessarily about the effects that the beer mat has on everybody or on the music all the time, but letting people find what potential is in that, in their universe, and how that shapes or doesn't shape their relationships to everything else that's happening.
In a way, it's more interesting now when some people are not doing the same thing as the others, because it gives some sort of reference point. The people sitting still frames the people moving in a different way.
I guess that depends on the situation. In the symphony orchestra, that probably wouldn't be a good thing. But and yeah, depending on life. I mean, we were preparing to do a version of Cornelius Cardio's The Tiger's Mind here with Keith Rowe, and he was talking a lot about when he improvised with other people, he would choose one of the characters from The Tiger's Mind rather than, you know, improvising freely. He would choose one of these roles when improvising with others without telling them. Mm-hmm. So he would, you know. But then after we played The Tiger's Mind, then they said, well, he didn't really play that role. He just improvised. So I guess that's something about that situation where, you know, it's a personal thing. I mean, someone would makes more sense to observe the rule and then know, well, it's there, but maybe not do it, as Kyrre was saying. And then others would probably follow that rule in some way. And that's kind of interesting, I think, with you know, your intention with these interventions.
Yeah.
Do they work when they're for all to do the same, or should it be open in a way?
We have one person in this jazz orchestra's ensemble now. He's talking about how to fuck up the rules. That's kind of what he wants to happen in the interventions. So.
And I quote, he's looking for the positive fuck you.
Yeah. Positive fuck, I'm sorry, I forgot the positive. But I was wondering about, because of course in this kind of research project, there's a lot of different people, there will be some resistance. And how that's affected your research? Do you applaud that when it happens? Does it make you feel that your research is going more forward, or would it be better if everyone was just joyful and happy and jumping into everything?
Well, if that's what I wanted, I wouldn't have picked these musicians to participate in the project, because as Kyrre was pointing out before the event, there's a lot of contrarians in this scene. And that's one of the reasons that we think it's such an interesting case study, is because people come from different backgrounds, they have different skill sets, and they have very different ideas of what kind of structure they want or they need. So it's a given. It's kind of baked into the project that people are going to relate to this stuff the different ways. That said, it makes me happy when people engage with what's offered on some level, and sometimes that requires time. So rather than receiving an offer of an intervention and saying, "Oh, it's not interesting to me," then you lose an opportunity there, at least to understand why it doesn't interest you, and to talk about it with us and see what effect that has, for example, on the people who are interested in it. That's something that's taken me a while to figure out myself in this project. This is now the 4th lab, so over the course of the 3 labs, that became very apparent to me that one needs to allow some space for this stuff to sink in, or for people to play with it on their own terms, rather than just pushing one thing and pushing the next and pushing the next, which was one of the mistakes I think we made in the first lab. It was like, you know, a 20-course menu in 15 minutes. Yeah. And that doesn't work for this kind of thing.
Yeah, I just had a question about your project and how your process of developing these interventions. So would you start with, like, how does a collaboration work? Like, would you start with concept of ethics that you want to test out musically, or is it the other way around, that you see, or both, maybe that you see something happen in a musical setting that inspires you to, like oh, this would connect to talking about, I don't know, honesty or something, and also like coming from philosophy, I'm curious to hear, you know, what ethical questions or what like concepts you are working with or trying out, if that's a way you're working, you know. So yeah, it's like two-part question, like what's a bit the method, and as I'm not yet part of this.
It's a great question. Perhaps we can think about that together over the course of the next musical interlude, and then talk about it afterwards. That work?
Let's keep this in mind then, and then welcome back the Trondheim Jazz Orchestra.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for the Trondheim Jazz Orchestra. And please come back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. You'll hear the full lineup then. What I find interesting about structures and stuff like that, playing scores, experimental scores, is that as we touched upon, I mean it does really depend on who's involved, their backgrounds and their attitude towards the music as well, of course. I found I was a part of this project some time ago, and half of the people involved were from a classical background, the other were from a more improvised jazz background. Playing the scores, we found out afterwards that the classical people tended to play a lot more than they normally do, and the jazz people ended up playing less than they normally do. So, and that was, one particular score, one particular event, but your background in music, of course, and who you are depends quite a lot in a situation like this. How does that kind of fit into the research you've been doing?
I think this connects to the question Sofia had earlier,
Yeah.
before the music. And so when we talk a lot about ethics, and for me, the ethics is not about the morality of what's happening on stage, but it's really about whether it's good or bad, or whether this practice is valuable or not valuable. But it's more the meta-ethical question, like, why does this show up as valuable? Why does it show up as good, as worthwhile? And so for that reason, the habits that people have developed as musicians is central to the work. And so, as you say, in people's training and their background and their history and the kind of places that they've played are extremely important to what happens on the stage. Because what we're seeing, particularly in the free improvised setting, I think more than any other scene perhaps, is people who have really diverse backgrounds. I mean, you've got Eira, who's a classical musician, and Kyrre, who's what did you call yourself? Potato. Yeah. And within the group, and the three groups we have as well, there's an incredible diversity. So where Trondheim is very interesting is we have a group of 9 musicians who had never played as that nonet before, as that constellation. But they knew each other. They, I think, had almost all studied here in Trondheim. They definitely played with the same kind of people. They're part of this pool of players. The group in Berlin, the Splitter Orchestra, is 21 people who have come from all over the world and many different styles and practices. But they've played together for a long time. They have a decade-long history of playing together. So there's an identity there as a group which wasn't here. But here the history is also... they have as much of a shared history, but rooted in the school and in the location. So these kind of backgrounds are really central to why certain things show up here as being important to the players.
Yeah, and I think we're talking about certain different kinds of freedoms as well, I suppose, because the first time you improvise with somebody, I mean, you can play all the cliches you like because they become new in that setting. If you play together with someone for 20 years, these cliches become something else, I think. Or
yeah, the word cliche is kind of a stone in my shoe. I'm not crazy about it. I mean, cliches exist in this music and in all musics, I guess, but there's a kind of people seem to be very sensitive about it because in this scene, because there's a high premium on not repeating yourself or on the new, and this is kind of in a way, it's a modernist holdover. But I think also people, they're very invested in their materials. They identify a lot with the kinds of sounds they make and the way that they work with people on a very personal level that you might not find among classical musicians, for example. And so there's this idea that this cliche is kind of like one of the cardinal vices, you know, that you would just be doing this thing that's just you doing this song and dance, and it has no meaning and no freshness anymore. At the same time, I think it's good to diffuse that a little bit and think more about habits rather than cliches. And habits are something that are necessary to music and all life forms. We can't always be inventing stuff consciously or perpetually. And it's good to be aware of like a spectrum of habits, so to speak. You know, habits we choose and we want to develop somehow that we need, versus habits that are just like collateral damage of doing things a certain way and end up limiting you over the long run. Yeah.
And this is a good example of what I mean by meta-ethical as well, is to say, okay, this is a cliche, but that also implies that new is a positive thing. So the question is not, you know, to assume that new is positive, but to ask, well, why is new in this context? Why is it important not to repeat oneself? And why is that a value compared to other forms of music where that's perhaps less of a taboo?
Comment.
Oh,
just the time, if you wanted questions from the audience as well.
I think I just want to really quickly make it practical again and bring it back to the last piece you played very nicely, because it sort of came from one of your interventions called groove fishing, but in the end what was performed here skipped all of the steps involved, and it just became playing the pond like the water that the fish swam around in a way, which I think is like a way of I think that's like an ethos to finding your own way around material. Like when you're working with improvised music a lot, I think it's important to people and it's important to me, which I think is in practice also the interventions become some sort of thing we have to work around, and I just thought that was an interesting like practical tidbit to say. Yeah. Just representing the band briefly.
Well, I guess that we are now approaching the last 5 minutes we've got here, and we will open for some comments, questions here. But I should also mention that we will be heading just across the street to Bergamin, so we can continue the conversation there for those who'd like to do that. There's obviously a limit to what we can discuss here now in 5 minutes. Any questions? There's a mic over there.
Yes, Simon.
I mean, I don't speak loudly. So just we're talking about the context of like backgrounds of people in this, like musicians and improvising and so on, and so the importance of the context of the players, and players you can kind of maybe expand to this whole project of research and improvisation. So how do you deal with the discipline of your academic research and that structure and the freedom, the supposed freedom that you're trying to facilitate with the musicians, and then on top of that the freedom that the musicians have within that? And so some of the things that I think maybe kind of might influence the research side is that you're initiating it. You're looking for certain things, I assume, in a kind of an academic way, and how that it's kind of like the direction of translation in a way. Like, how do the musicians find their freedom? Or maybe another way around, are there constraints, do you think, for the musicians in this context of research and that they're leading the research? Does that make any sense? Maybe it's too complicated, but do you know what I mean?
Musicians should answer.
That was too complicated for my little head.
The simple version. What is the simple version of your question?
Just the problematics of free improvisation and academic research, how it's been for you in the time.
Because I was thinking about that when we had this listening now, that I was wondering because the researchers have set up these concerts with this, and I wonder what is the reason for having us playing the concerts as at big events, because I was also wondering what is the importance of that according to just playing together and listening to our rehearsals. So I just doubled the question, kind of.
Yeah, I'll go with the first part. I think this is part of the nature of any kind of scientific research. It's a danger and a feature and a fact, I guess, is that I think most science proceeds with a framework. It kind of projects that onto the world, and then obviously it will be biased towards the things which already fit that framework. And these things will always be there, even when you try to shift that framework. That's coming with a different kind of framework. And so I don't really know. I suppose it's being open to the phenomena. It's that's where I take my starting point from my own sort of little philosophical corner of this project, is really putting the thing in the center, but acknowledging I'm going to be seeing that through a particular methodology, through particular lenses, and this can always be critiqued from different angles. But it's a very live thing in the philosophy of science, actually. And yeah, I won't speak for half an hour.
Yeah, it is a problem. It's a problem in the sense that it's a dialectic that gives us an opportunity to learn something both about research and about music that we wouldn't if we didn't have that kind of tension. So it's an ongoing question how to deal with it in this project. Obviously in an institutional context, it's like, we're given a pot of money and there's a certain hierarchy that we have to cope with, and at the end we need to deal with certain questions and we need to tell a story about it. So that's something that we try to be transparent about in the project with the musicians. It's like, yes, you're doing your own thing, but don't forget that we have to deal with X, Y, and Z. And the challenge is to find a way to present that's not completely hemming in, what our collaborators really want to do. And the fact that you're here asking these questions is a good sign that we're doing something right. That is to say that we're not ignoring it and we're having a dialogue about how to deal with that. So this is the 4th lab among 7, and maybe by the end we'll be able to answer that better. Quick question, why are there concerts? There's 2 reasons. One is because in my experience as a musician, not as an academic, musicians' strongest ethical commitments are to those things that they share with other people. So conventionally, concerts and recordings. That's what really counts for most musicians. And I think that allowing for this telos, for having this goal at the end of each lab, or most of the labs, of sharing this with the public, puts a kind of motor for the whole thing, where the research is no longer about just playing around with ideas behind closed doors, but there's some kind of a consequence towards what happens in the work. And the other reason why we have the concerts is simply because we want to share it with people. That we don't only want people to read about it in books and articles and maybe videos online, but we want to be here interacting with people and see how it works in the wild.
And on that note, this session is kind of dissolving its formality into something a bit more informal by moving from here. I know, but we're over the time, so we can ask the questions on our way out over to Bjørnstad. If it's a quick question, you can take it and we can answer it.
I
I wondered in the performance setting, for example, do you allow the musicians to create their own structure and give them their, so they design the whole intervention themselves, or?
Yeah, we decided that we would play freely improvised tomorrow
Yeah.
in the like the musicians pool, and we said that's what we're gonna do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it doesn't really demonstrate, tomorrow doesn't really demonstrate the research.
The working method.
In any
Well,
way.
That's something that we should probably talk about over a beer, because it's not an either or thing, but there's something happening, I think.
The kind of rejection of the, like, is it a rejection of the ideas?
I think the ideas are circulating around, but we decided not to like play the interventions at given times. They might arise, but we haven't planned to do so.
So we really need to move now because
Yep.
there's new sound checks and things going on here. But this isn't over. It's just the formal setting that's over. So please come along to Bar and ask more questions and continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Yes, just later.